Hello, everyone. It's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive. Welcome to this live stream. The era of US dominance has effectively ended. So says India's external affairs minister. He's their foreign minister. Bharat's external affairs minister has said this just in recent days, but it echoes comments he's made really over a number of years, including extensively argued comments he's made in his book, The India Way, and his most recent book, I think it's called Why Bharat Matters. And we're going to talk about those comments and what they mean. Because in a way, Jaishankar there is reflecting a view that American primacy is no longer the thing that every country around the world, every culture in the world looks up to or is afraid of. The world is responding in different ways to the role of America in the world, and that is changing geopolitics. It's changing world history, but even more so, it's changing the everyday culture that we all live in, that we all try to express, including here on YouTube. It's no longer just an American century. It is the world century, the 21st century and 21st century. And Dr. S. Jaishankar is really reflecting those comments. So this is another of my series of live streams. My name's Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive. If you haven't been to this channel before, and the Burning Archive is it's like a newsletter, a blog, a Substack, which you can join at jeffrich.substack.com, and where I write a weekly essay on world affairs, world history, world culture and literature, and how we, all of us, can live in tune with a changing world, not just thinking about the big issues for world leaders and geopolitics, but actually trying to relate it to the stories we all have about surviving in this turbulent world. And in addition, there's clearly this YouTube channel, and I also offer courses at courses.jeffrichwriter.com, including a new introductory course, seeing the geopolitical world clearly with history. And in many ways, these remarks by Dr. S. Jaishankar, I think, are the kind of thing that I'll be covering in this course, because I think a lot of the inherited ideas that we've come to use in, geopolitics, political analysis, world history analysis, a lot of those ideas have become, I guess, a little bit outdated, and they're just no longer relevant. And one of the central ideas, I guess, is the idea of the unipolar moment, the unipolar world, the world in which America is the sole superpower, and there is a big gap in power between the United States and the rest of the world. And that is what I'll be commenting on today. And that is what Dr. S. Jaishankar was commenting on. Now, I say Dr. S. Jaishankar because I always struggle to remember his first name, and my apologies to Dr. Jaishankar for that. But it's Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, and he's a very distinguished Indian diplomat. He was, the head of the Indian Foreign Affairs Department, and I believe his father might have been too, or at least his father was the head of department. His brother might have been the head of. So he's kind of from a very successful family, I guess, or a family that is used to thinking about world strategy and all that kind of thing. And he, for the last 5 years or so, has been India's foreign minister. And what a time to be India's foreign minister. And really, especially, I think, since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, there has been a world. He has really become one of the star diplomats on the world stage, partly because India has taken such an intelligent, independent, if you like, stance on the issue of the war in Ukraine. It's put Australian foreign policy to shame, I might say. If Dr. Jaishankar is watching the show, I hope you don't. I hope you accept that compliment. And he has made these recent remarks about American primacy, and he has also, it's one of a series of remarks where I guess he has spoken on behalf of the global majority or the global south. The global majority seems increasingly the preferred term, to say United States, Europe, Western Europe, Anglo-American world, you no longer dictate terms to the rest of the world. As he famously said to Europe, you can't continue thinking that the world's problems are not your problems and your problems are the world's problems. And I think that is really changing the tone of international diplomacy. It's also changing the power dynamics of geopolitics in a very dramatic way. So that's what we're going to be talking about on the show today. Now, if you are watching live or if you're watching the replay of this live stream, leave us a chat comment if you're watching live. Say hello. I can see a few people watching now, and just say hi and say where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Love to make this interactive. I'm just starting out really on the live stream thing, and I sort of kind of went a little bit overachieved last week with the technology. So I've gone back to a more simpler form of technology this time around. But do by all means say hi and where you're listening from. I'd love to interact with you during the show. But if you don't want to, that's totally fine as well. But if you are watching, I probably should also put my glasses on so I could read things there. And I've got a comment here from Blex saying, Jaishankar is a man of integrity and honesty. I hope he can resolve the issues with China. Cheers from Germany. Hello to Germans. Wonderful to hear some people from Germany. And Germany and Europe, I guess I'll talk about them a little bit later on in the show, but that is very true. The conflict between India and China is actually a very important dimension of Dr. Jaishankar's priorities. There's a little bit of extra attention to it, I think, at the moment. I think partly because of the Indian election campaign. But it's if you read Dr. Jaishankar's book, The Indian Way, about its sort of Indian foreign policy, it gives a really interesting perspective on that relationship between India and China. Very long-standing relationship too. And Edgar Dawson from Sweden. Hi, Edgar. Lovely to hear from you. I guess it must be pretty early in the morning in Sweden at the moment. So I'm really glad that, and thank you so much for thanking me for my work. For me, it's been a real honor to be able to find a bit of an audience here on the YouTube. And it's great to be able to find people with not necessarily having the same opinions about things, but people asking the same questions and being curious and wanting to explore some of the same issues around the world. So thanks very much for saying hi to Edgar and to Blex. All right, now, before we get into Dr. Jaishankar's remarks that the era of US dominance is over, I wonder if people in Europe have quite caught up with the stunning pictures that have appeared during the day. Yeah, excellent. Good idea, Blex. Do check out Dr. Jaishankar's book. He's also just recently released a second book called, I think, Why Bharat is Important or something like that. And, you can get it for just the online bookshops. And it's really, really interesting. And you see, one of the things he says, which goes to the theme of this live stream, is he basically said the world is returning to its natural state of multipolarity. That, the kind of ideas we had about the world from 1989, that, there's a unipolar world or even a bipolar world before then, are fading away, and the reality of a very diverse world in which there's lots of different space and lots of different resources for everyone is really coming back to the fore. So it's very much the theme of the show, and also, I guess, what Dr. Jaishankar is saying, that the era of dominance is over, the unipolar moment is over. But as if to almost reinforce this, the United States Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has appeared overnight in a bar in Kiev, playing a red guitar and singing a bit of a song about, rocking the world or something like that, rocking all over the world. It's almost like a reductio ad absurdum, an absurd reduction of the comic state of, is this what US primacy has been reduced to? Okay, and I might, make a few funny remarks about Tony Blinken and his red guitar in Kiev later in the show, because you may know that I do also like to try to connect world events in an imaginative way to the world's literature, not just the West literature, the world's literature. And the idea of Tony Blinken strumming his guitar as the Ukrainian army and government is collapsing in a tragic situation where, I don't know, like over 1,000 people are being killed every day, is just, it's absurd almost. It almost makes one want to cry. But it also brought to my mind Wallace Stevens' book, poem rather, The Man with a Blue Guitar. But I'll come back to that later on in the live stream. All right, so let's talk about Dr. Jaishankar's comments. And he said the dominance of the USA, which started after the end of the Cold War, has effectively come to an end. Now, he's made these remarks in the context of the current Indian election campaign, in which Indian foreign policy is actually quite important, because it's one of the notable features of the Modi government over the last 10 years or so is that India has, for the first time in a very long time, been ruled by a majority government rather than by a coalition government. And that's enabled a stronger, more assertive foreign policy, and that stronger and more assertive foreign policy, originally under Modi's direction, but really over the last 5 years or so, very much politically directed by Dr. S. Jaishankar, has been a very central plank of the both political but also cultural reassertion of India, that is Bharat, the preferred name really in India and by Dr. S. Jaishankar for that state. The name that is actually in the Indian constitution, which reads India, that is Bharat, it's been part of the, I guess, reassertion of India in the world. And within that election campaign, there has been more than a... Oh, Plex, I was concentrating on my script and not getting all your comments, but we will come back to Tony Blinken's comedy a little bit later. Within the context of the election campaign, there have been reported innuendos, suggestions, claims of influence operations from the United States, from Britain, from Canada, and from Western NGOs. In India, George Soros, a number of years, about 6 to 12 months ago, said he felt that India was not really a democracy, and Dr. S. Jaishankar famously sort of shut him down as, rich, old, opinionated white man who's not only he wouldn't really care about it if he was just rich, old, opinionated white man, but he's also dangerous because he's undermining the cohesion of India. There's been claims about Britain and its various documentaries reviving 20 or 30-year-old claims about Narendra Modi also engaging in influence operations. Same thing with the United States, some rather dodgy remarks at times from the US ambassador to India. And of course, there's been a huge fracas with India and its claims of, sort of overseas assassination attempts by India, and its the counterclaims by India that Canada has sort of harbored Khalistani terrorists. But there is this general sense within many Western countries that, under the Hindu nationalism and that sort of thing, there's a concern that India is no longer liberal and democratic, that under Modi, it is a little bit too independent to be truly a part of the West. And this is also, to some degree, what Dr. S. Jaishankar is responding to in his remarks. He's saying, he's making what appears at some level to be a neutral, objective statement of the state of the world, that the dominance of the USA has effectively come to an end. But he's also making an assertion there that it's time for the USA to stop trying to play politics in Indian domestic politics. And then so very much Dr. Jaishankar's remarks are a bit of a rebuff, I guess, to this kind of effort, these kind of efforts amongst Western governments. You've even seen it here in Australia. Not so much explicitly so by the Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, but certainly there have been, like the former head of the Foreign Affairs Department in Australia, Peter Varghese, who himself is a man of sort of Indian-Australian origin, he sort of made remarks that he felt more comfortable with the liberal secular traditions of India. And there's, a lot of sort of worry about whether India is backsliding into some sort of authoritarian regime. On the other hand, there's the American political sociologist Salvatore Babones, who who I think has broadly rebutted many of these claims about India backsliding into authoritarianism. And he's also totally, taken apart the various democracy indexes and things like that that are published by Western government-sponsored NGOs that claim that India is not really all that much of a democracy. So Jaishankar's remarks are, I think, also to some degree rebuttal of these kind of influence operations, and it may well be that what we will be seeing in a couple of weeks is the Indian electorate, or 1.4 billion people, with the elections, being conducted over approximately a 2-month period, and with results being declared on, I think it's the 4th of June. These election results may well really make that rebuttal of the idea that India is not a democracy very loud and clear. All the predictions seem to be that the Modi government will be re-elected with a strong majority, and India will go its own way. India, the mother of democracy, as Narendra Modi and many Indian intellectuals know it as. Now, although there is that, I guess, political diplomatic edge to Dr. Jaishankar's remarks, I think they are also very much on the money and, putting his finger on probably the central issue of geopolitics, of world history, if you like, of our time. And that central issue is that American primacy is collapsing. It's collapsing, and that presents issues for the rest of the world, because I guess, the rest of the world has looked at how America behaves and looked at what it thinks about itself, and has had to respond, share the space of the world with America in a way that they won't get hurt. And so people have perhaps put up with the idea that, America is the greatest nation ever to existed on Earth, and American supremacy and all that sort of thing, for a couple of decades, while never really quite believing it. But to actually directly challenge it out in the public domain has been rather more difficult, because if you do challenge it, you get called a dictator, you get called authoritarian, you get called a threat to world order as we know it. As I think Yuval Harari recently said, Russia has very much played the role since, I think it was 2007, when Vladimir Putin made his famous Munich security dialogue speech, where he excuse me, I've just had a little brain fade there, where he said a multipolar world is coming into being, and the world can no longer accept rules as dictated by America. China has also been the butt of American determination to keep its primacy. Joe Biden famously said, that America would not, slip from being number one on his watch. And so India has been cautious and diplomatic, really, I guess, up to now, in its assertion of its independence, its assertion of the multipolar world, its assertion that US primacy is no longer the case. But that is changing, and it's changing in response to realities. It's changing in response to the fact that there simply is not the same level of power gap between the United States and the rest of the world, the other nations of the world, that there was in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Up until that time, there was a world of relatively equal competition between the Soviet Union and the United States of America and their various allies. And if you looked a little bit more closely, you'd realize that even back then it wasn't quite a bipolar world. It was a multipolar world. There was the non-aligned movement. China was playing a role. China was powerful under Mao, but in a way grew even more powerful after Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, and it's straddling, I guess, of the communist world and the capitalist world. And so what Dr. Jaishankar is really putting his finger on is there is now both a change in the reality of the power gap between the United States and America that simply does not justify the claim to American primacy. And what's more, there is a difference in the perception of American primacy. In some ways, the schoolyard bully is not getting away with it anymore. The rest of the world's nations are really asserting themselves again, and that is really changing the dynamics of power all around the world. And I think that's probably has accelerated dramatically since the events of October last year and the tragic events that seem to be that are occurring in Gaza as we speak. The diplomatic influence of the world, of the United States, has evaporated dramatically. And in my most recent, in fact, the Substack article that I am bringing out tonight at 6:30 p.m. our time, which is in about an hour and a half, it will come out shortly after this stream, will go into a little bit more detail about some of Dr. Jaishankar's recent remarks and, how I see the power distribution around the world. And you can sign up to my Substack by going to Jeff Rich, that's JEFFRICH.substack.com. And I produce a free weekly newsletter on every Saturday morning, which is like an essay, like 1,000-ish word essay on world history, world culture, world literature, really around three big themes of, I guess, this symphony of civilizations, the social changes going on in the world, and reconnecting with some of the treasured cultural traditions of the world, particularly for me, at least, in world literature. And so you can do that, but also on Wednesdays, I also produce a premium post. A lot of that's available to free subscribers as well. But if you upgrade your subscription to a premium subscription, which I think is like $10 a month, maybe Australian, or $8 a month Australian, maybe it's $8 US and $10 Australian, then you can get all that content, as well as the access to my sort of archive, where I discuss the history of the multipolar world and patterns of globalization today, some classics of world literature, some classics of world history. So some of the content, if you like it on my YouTube channel, you almost certainly will enjoy reading my Substack. So if you haven't already done so, type into your browser right now, if you like, jeffrich.substack.com, and sign up to my weekly newsletter there. But in some ways, Dr. Jaishankar's remarks are a stronger, rhetorically stronger statement, I think, of a theme that he's spoken about for some time. And in fact, like a couple of months ago on my Substack, I pointed out a series of remarks that Dr. Jaishankar that Dr. Jaishankar made in Japan at the Raisana Forum. Now, the Raisana Forum is a kind of an Indian soft power diplomatic initiative where I guess Indian diplomats and intellectuals meet with other countries' diplomats and intellectuals, including there's been a Raisana Forum in Sydney, for example. In Australia. But this forum was in Japan, I think, in the early part of 2024. And Dr. Jaishankar there made 8 points about the state of the world and the historical changes that we are observing. And each of these 8 changes really go into a little bit more detail about how the era of US dominance has effectively come to an end, how the era of the unipolar moment of American primacy has come to an end, and that sensible people around the world, sensible diplomats and intellectuals and political leaders around the world ought to come to terms with these new realities and try to live in tune with this changing world. That is an expression that Dr. Jaishankar uses at the start of his book, The Indian Way. It's an expression from an ancient Tamil poet whose name I have a little bit of trouble pronouncing, but I think it's Tiruvalla. So if there are any Tamil or sort of Indian language speakers online who can correct my pronunciation, let me know, and or point me to a place where I can get that pronunciation a little bit better. Anyhow, let me just give you a bit of a sense of what these 8 remarks are, because I think they're very informative to help you actually understand the changing world today. Because I mean, Dr. Jaishankar is like the chief diplomat of the world's most populous nation, of one of its most diplomatically influential nations, and in many ways he's one of the world's, if not the world's, most capable, articulate and thoughtful diplomats. And this is what he says about that sort of 8 big changes in the world. First of all, he says, global order created by the accumulation of political and economic rebalancing, accelerated by globalization, reflects emerging multipolarity. And he says on measures of GDP, even more so GDP when measured by purchasing power parity terms, I would add, technology, influence, or demography, the top 30 or 20 or 30 nations today are not what they were 2 decades ago, even less than what they were 4 or 8 decades ago. We still, in many ways, live in the post-1945 world, the 5 nations of the UN Security Council. But that is a very different world to what we actually have today. And his second point is that the relative weight, importance, and capability of countries have changed. This is his point. The effective dominance of the United States has changed, reflected in the weight, importance, and capabilities of those countries. There's no league table of power. There's no real simple way of testing and assessing that sort of relative power and influence. There is just all these different processes and capabilities. The world order, he says, is becoming less predictable or even less disciplined, and rising disorder in common processes are driving multilateralism in which like-minded partners gather together for a particular purpose. The third point, and I'm going to do a bit of a edit of my live stream and release it as a separate video later, and then I will probably add in some of the visuals that I've given myself a bit of a break on technical prowess and operating OBS today. So I hope you don't mind, live stream viewers, but there will be an edited version of this with the text of these statements to make it a little bit easier to follow, that you should check back in on with the YouTube channel at a later date. So, or in like a day or two. The third point he makes is the geography of geopolitics has changed so that the world map is no longer neatly compartmentalized into theaters for the convenience of dominant powers, as in the post-1945 world. Now, someone should tell the United States, with its sort of African command and its Indo-Pacific command and its CENTCOM and its Europe command. But the reality is that the world map is returning to its natural multipolarity, its natural diversity, its natural complexity. And this kind of block thinking that the United States has never really let go of since 1945 and the crusade against communism. This block thinking is simply outdated in our current world. And then his fourth point, which is that interdependence has increased, and with it competition for control of the process. I would call this new tides of globalization. I've written a few things on this on my Substack, which if you subscribe, you can go into that in a bit more detail. But we understand globalization commonly as, I guess, westernization. But really, globalization is the long distance exchange of goods, ideas, of people around the world. And the way in which that is changing is it constantly changes. Increasingly today, the source of many of those long-distance exchanges is not the West. It is China. It is India. It is Russia. It is Africa. It's Latin America. It's Eastern Europe. It's all over the place. But what Dr. Jaishankar says here is tremendous economic and technology concentrations. Think Google, think, I guess, banking, think vaccines during the health crisis of a few years ago, which now have major strategic implications. These have led to the leveraging of trade, of investment, connectivity, resources, and even of mobility. In many cases, the nature of power itself has undergone a change. And of course, these are not just remarks directed against about the West. They're also, for Dr. Jaishankar, remarks oriented to China as well. There is a competition between India and China to some degree, which I think, Blex referred to earlier on during the show, and to some degree, competition as for IT and manufacturing and that sort of thing, but also, if you like, what he's also referring to is the initiative has changed so that some of the old choke points of the world, including the choke points in the media and the big tech and big finance and all that sort of thing, those choke points are simply no longer viable. The currents of change have bypassed them, and the world is sort of moving on. The era of effective US dominance is over. His fifth point is that the global attitudes have shifted so that strategic autonomy is therefore sought by many more countries and regions. Alas, not in Australia. Alas, not in many parts of the European Union. I think Sweden and Germany, Edgar and Blex, both in countries that perhaps have compromised their strategic autonomy a little bit in recent times. But I'm not putting any shade on you guys at all, because Australia is the loyalist of Captain Ahab's, sweepers of the deck on the desperate ship of the Pequod, run by the American Captain Ahab. The sixth comment is global risk-taking has increased, e.g., Vladimir Putin was prepared to take the risk of a major conflict with the West over the borders of NATO in Ukraine. The seventh point is that the United Nations remains the only true global forum, so its reform must be persevered with, and an overall balance kept in favour of freedom, openness, transparency, and a rules-based order, not necessarily the liberal rules-based order, but the United Nations Charter rules-based order. And finally, India is a very different country today. It is important for the world to recognise this. And this is also the theme of Dr. Jaishankar's recent remarks in saying the era of US dominance is over. The era of the US, controlling India through emigre politicians in England or in the United States is over. At least in India, even if it seems to still be happening in some other benighted countries around the world. And so this is really important. This was an earlier version of his statement, but his recent statements are very much emphasizing just how much India is changing. The G20 last year, was it last year or earlier this year? Yeah, last year in New Delhi, which was in many ways a diplomatic triumph for India, was also bringing the world to India and showing the world to India in a very different way. So Dr. Jaishankar's words are really making waves, I think, in the halls of power around the world. But it's not just an issue, I think, for political leaders or geostrategists or whatever they are, or people in think tanks, or people who just like to talk about geopolitics on their YouTube channel like me. I think this is also something that is of significance culturally around the world, because although absolutely the collapse of American primacy is going to shape geopolitical news over the next decade, I think, potentially in not great ways, because America, think of Lindsey Graham's recent remarks about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Israel perhaps doing something similar to Gaza. Heaven forbid.